I knew something was wrong before Graham touched her back, because Elise Monroe looked at me as if I had forgotten my own guest. The tasting room at the Cannon Beach Hotel smelled like sea salt, rosemary butter, and money that expected clean answers from calm professionals. Marin Whitlock was already beside my husband, holding a folder that matched the one resting on my lap. Graham smiled too easily, pulled out the chair next to her instead of mine, and made the room colder without raising his voice. Marin offered me her hand like we had agreed to meet, her rings cool against my fingers, her smile practiced enough to pass as kindness. I had built this rebrand from guest notes, shoreline research, late revisions, and 3 weeks of strategy no outsider had permission to touch. This dinner was supposed to confirm me as creative lead, not introduce a freelance brand strategist through my husband's private confidence. Elise cleared her throat and said she was excited to see how the combined perspective had evolved. And that word combined landed hard. Graham leaned toward me with the calm voice he used whenever he wanted a lie to wear a clean shirt. Marin just helped me think through a cleaner angle, he murmured, as if my work were a messy kitchen he had politely tidied. I smiled because Elise was watching, because servers were setting down plates, because reputation can crack from one badly timed reaction. Then Marin opened her folder, and the first page carried a phrase from a private draft I had never sent her. I answered Elise's first question with a steady voice, but inside, every detail began lining itself into evidence. Marin's hand rested on the back of Graham's chair too naturally, and Graham watched my face instead of watching the client. On the drive home, he told me I had seemed tense, like concern could cover what he had dragged into that room. His phone lay face down between us, black under the dashboard light, and I understood dinner had not started anything. It only made him careless. Before that dinner, Graham had known how to stand beside me without making the room feel crowded. He used to rehearse pitches in our Portland kitchen, leaning against the counter while coffee cooled, saying, "Brooke, you make people believe the idea belongs in their life." Lately, his compliments had gone thin. His evenings stretched later, and his phone vanished from tables the second I entered. After Cannon Beach, those absences stopped feeling small, because Marin had spoken my language with words she should never have had. The next morning, her email arrived before my second coffee, polite enough to insult me without leaving fingerprints. "Thank you for letting me review the early direction. Brooke," she wrote, though I had never invited her into the work. In the client thread, she called me passionate twice, softening the word until it sounded like unstable wearing better shoes. When Graham came home and asked why I seemed distracted, I closed my laptop and said, "Just tired," because his answer already lived in the message he thought I had overlooked. I met Dana Price 2 days later at a Pearl District cafe, where rain slid down the window and made the street look rinsed clean. Dana had known me since my first agency job, and she listened without the face people use when they want drama more than truth. She asked who had been copied, what changed after the calendar invite, and whether Marin's wording matched any draft I owned. That was when the story stopped being a feeling and became a sequence. That night, I created a folder called Timeline and saved Marin's email, the client thread, and the Cannon Beach agenda. I did not feel powerful. Not yet. But I felt less foolish for noticing what they hoped I would excuse. Graham slept beside me with his phone turned downward on the nightstand, and the dark screen looked almost honest in its silence. I stared at it until morning. Understanding softness could be a weapon when the wrong woman carried it carefully. The receipt fell from Graham's coat while I sorted laundry, a white slip carrying more truth than his careful mouth had given me all week. The reservation name was Marin Whitlock. The restaurant was across Portland, and the time matched his supposed vendor dinner 2 towns away that night perfectly. I stood beside the washer, reading the final line twice, until my stomach turned colder than the floor beneath my bare feet that morning alone. "No cinnamon on dessert," the note read, and that preference belonged to Graham. something I had mentioned near Marin only once before at dinner casually. It was not dramatic proof at all, but it was a clean thread. And clean threads were harder to dismiss than a shaking voice in public later. I took the receipt to Patrick Rowe the next morning, folded inside my planner like it might burn through the leather cover all morning quietly. His office overlooked wet brick buildings while he listened without interrupting as I laid out the email. Agenda. And Marin's polished little lie quietly. Patrick did not promise payback. Only clarity, sliding the papers back toward me as if emotion had to wait outside the room that day completely. Do not access private accounts. Do not threaten anyone. Keep what comes through work channels. And document every overlap. He warned me carefully again today. Then he tapped the receipt once, because the issue was not dinner, but the pattern forming around my professional name and client work now clearly. That warning steadied me because the receipt, the thread, and the draft phrase all pointed toward one direction neither of them could soften in any room when nobody asked. Graham was not only stepping outside our marriage, he was letting Marin step into my work through doors he quietly held open for her behind me. That night, he watched me rinse a glass and suggested I seemed really overwhelmed, maybe too tired to carry the hotel account alone without support. I looked at him over the sink, smiled softly, and slowly understood his concern was not care anymore, but preparation for my removal from everything right there. Elise saw the crack before anyone admitted there was one, and she did it without raising her voice across the table. We were reviewing the coastal guest journey when she paused over Marin's slide and asked why my early positioning phrase appeared there. Graham moved too fast, smoothing his palm over the table as if he could press the question flat before it reached anyone. He offered, "We are just trying to protect the account," while Marin softened her mouth and added that I had been under a lot lately. The room did not turn loud, but it changed, because Elise stopped studying the deck and started studying the people behind it. I opened my laptop before Graham could turn concern into a longer sentence, then pulled up the time-stamped draft, sent only to the approved team. The same line sat there, dated earlier, untouched, with my notes attached beside the phrase Marin had presented as cleaner refinement. I kept my voice even and told Elise, "I prefer we keep authorship and approval clean from here," because that was enough. Marin's smile held 1 second too long, and Graham stared at the screen like the date might rearrange itself out of loyalty. Elise nodded slowly, not warmly, then wrote in her folder and requested all future revisions come through one channel. No one accused anyone, but the room understood the difference between collaboration and access that had never been granted. Later, Dana helped me arrange the emails, invite changes, copied threads, and draft records into a timeline that read colder than any speech. By midnight, the pattern looked less like confusion and more like a careful shape they had built around my professional name. Marin's polite words kept placing me near instability, while Graham's concern kept offering her as the reasonable woman who could steady the work. I sat at my kitchen table with Dana's notes beside me, watching every small document pull the next one into place. They had not needed to shout to damage me. They only had to sound worried long enough for someone important to listen. The coastal preview was held in the hotel's upstairs lounge, where gray water moved beyond the windows and every table looked polished enough to hide a setup. Elise had invited travel partners, 2 local media buyers, and the creative team, which gave Graham an audience without making it look staged. Marin arrived in a cream suit, Graham half a step behind her, both carrying the confidence of people who thought my silence had been handled. I sat near the window with my folder closed, watching them confuse composure with surrender while the Pacific pressed gray light against the glass. Marin began in the same soft voice she used whenever control needed to pass as help in front of people who valued manners. She spoke about emotional continuity, coastal intimacy, and guest memory, using the bones of my strategy with enough polish to make theft look collaborative. Graham nodded at the right moments, glancing at Elise whenever Marin sounded gentle, as if gentleness could become proof of permission. Then Elise asked who had formally approved the direction, and the room went still enough for every paper edge to sound sharp. Graham looked at me first, waiting for anger, tears, or one broken sentence he could fold into the story he had been building. I opened my folder and placed the sequence in front of Elise, my time-stamped draft, Marin's vendor email, and the revision trail from her presentation file. No formal approval was given for Marin to revise, present, or circulate my campaign direction, I said, keeping my voice low and clean. One media buyer leaned forward and asked whether Marin was officially attached to the account. And I answered, "Not through me," without looking at Graham. He cut in with, "This is not the place." But Elise did not look away from the pages resting under her hand. "Actually, it is. Because this is my brand being moved through a channel I did not approve," she replied, and Marin's face changed. Nobody shouted, but her name stopped sounding like an option and started sounding like a liability in a room built around reputation. Elise closed the folder, paused all further communication, and I stepped into the hallway knowing I had not won yet. But denial had finally become expensive, and that small shift was enough for me to breathe. After the preview, I did not post a word, call anyone crying, or give Graham the reaction he needed to repaint himself as reasonable. I drove back to Portland with Dana's timeline on the passenger seat, each page clipped in order, each timestamp cleaner than my pulse. Patrick reviewed the sequence and told me the next step had to be boring, formal, and impossible to twist. That sounded right, because Graham expected pain to arrive loudly enough for him to blame the noise. Patrick's letter went first, notifying Graham through counsel that divorce proceedings were moving forward and all documents tied to the hotel account had to be preserved. Elise's letter followed from Cannon Beach, pausing unapproved communication with Marin and requiring Graham's company to explain his role in exposing client materials. My own studio notice went out last, short and dry, confirming that I remained the approved creative lead and all revisions would route through me. There was no grand speech, only paper moving through the right doors. And somehow that felt stronger than screaming in every room they softened against me. Graham called before dinner, then texted twice, then sent a message so careful it sounded reviewed by panic instead of conscience. "This got misunderstood. Brooke. And Marin was only helping because I was worried you were carrying too much," he wrote, as if worry explained access. Marin's email arrived an hour later, long and gentle, claiming she never meant to hurt anyone while avoiding every file she had touched. I forwarded it to Patrick without answering, and the silence felt clean because every sentence they sent now belonged to the record. By morning, Graham's company had opened an internal review after Elise's complaint, and 2 vendors asked whether Marin was still attached to the account. Dana read the updates at my kitchen table, coffee untouched, while I watched the chain reaction move where the evidence pointed. Nobody needed to hate them, and nobody needed to love me. They only needed to see the risk they had created. When Graham appeared outside my building, smaller, he whispered, "I made a mistake," and I understood he was not sorry for the wound, only that it had witnesses. The settlement room was smaller than I expected, with a glass table, 2 pitchers of water, and Graham sitting across from me in a suit that no longer carried him. His lawyer arranged papers like they could rebuild the version of him that once worked in public, while Patrick placed our timeline down without ceremony. Graham looked at the folder, then at me, and for the first time since Cannon Beach, his face had no practiced calm left. He looked tired, cornered, and strangely ordinary, like a man finally being introduced to the cost of being believed too long after everyone stopped helping. Patrick began with the hotel emails, the revision trail, and Elise's complaint, each document landing quietly enough to make Graham's silence feel louder. His lawyer tried to narrow it to marital problems, But Patrick kept the line clean, because this was professional harm tied to unauthorized access. Graham shifted in his chair and murmured, "Our marriage was already complicated. Brooke." As if complication could explain making another woman useful through me. I looked at him and answered, "A hard marriage did not give you permission to turn my name into her doorway for your convenience." That was the first moment he looked small enough for my anger to lose its edge and become something colder, chum. Patrick moved through the settlement terms, including legal fees tied to the dispute, protection of my client relationships, and a mutual non-disparagement clause. The clause did not erase truthful professional responses, and Graham's jaw tightened because losing the story hurt him more than losing the room. Maren was not there, but Elise's email confirmed she had been removed from the campaign and dropped from the vendor list immediately. When it ended, Graham lingered near the door and asked if someday we could talk like two people who had loved each other. I picked up my folder and told him, "Maybe someday I will remember the good parts without needing to forgive the rest." Then I left before his face could ask me to soften again, leaving him with the papers, the silence, and what he had earned. Months later, I returned to Cannon Beach for the hotel launch, wearing a navy dress and the calm Graham once mistook for weakness. The new campaign filled the lobby walls with clean lines, weathered textures, and language I had protected from hands that never earned it. Elise introduced me to the partners as the creative lead who kept the project steady, and nobody mentioned Graham or Maren. Their absence felt louder than any apology, because they had wanted into this room, and the room had learned to close without them. Back in Portland, I moved into a smaller apartment near the Willamette, where morning rain softened the windows and nothing in the kitchen remembered his voice. Dana came over with lemon cake, looked around, and smiled. "This place finally sounds like you," which made me laugh before I could stop myself. Graham still emailed sometimes. Always careful. Always asking for one conversation that would make him feel less like the man in those documents. I never answered, because his regret no longer had permission to enter my day and rearrange the furniture. Maren drifted out of the local event circle, taking smaller work where nobody asked why a trusted client had quietly stopped returning her messages. I did not celebrate that, but I did not mourn it either, because consequences do not need my applause to become real. Standing in that hotel lobby, beneath the campaign wall carrying my work, I finally understood what I had taken back. Not my marriage, not his apology, not the years he cheapened, but my name, my peace, and a life that did not need permission to feel whole again. Thank you for staying with Brooke's story. If this felt familiar, share your thoughts below with someone who understands quiet strength. Sometimes healing begins when you stop begging to be believed. Protect your peace, and let life become gentle again. Subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself with grace.